Hello, my name is Phillip Savino, and in this video I will be talking about the presidential strategies of President Kennedy and President Johnson during the Vietnam War. The early involvement of President Kennedy was basically an extension of what Eisenhower had set up after Vietnam was divided at the 17th parallel, with the communists controlling the northern part and the United Nations controlling the southern sectors of Vietnam. Was an extension of military personnel acting as advisors. They extended economic aid to Vietnam and to basically the government of South Vietnam was run by President Diem at the time when President Kennedy became the president. There were a lot of internal problems in South Vietnam that swayed the actions and reactions of President Kennedy. The biggest internal divisions in South Vietnam involved corruption within the government, a lot of religious differences, and mounting successes of the Viet Cong, especially those insurgencies that were planted and ongoing within South Vietnam. Under the government of President Diem of South Vietnam, he was Catholic, and he was experiencing a lot of protests from the other religions that were in the country, especially the Buddhists, which were primarily a large majority of people within Vietnam. They were setting themselves on fire and things like that. And his police chief had actually rounded up a lot of those Buddhists and treated them very cruelly, executing some of them in many cases. Those internal divisions is definitely, I would say, what split the decision of President Kennedy on whether to fully commit to a war in Vietnam or just continue acting as an economic aid, basically. And during Vietnam, while Kennedy was in the presidency, he, according to our book, America's War in Vietnam by Larry Addington, he actually had mentioned that he didn't want to actually commit U.S. forces and directly engage the communists because, well, it could have triggered another war with China and with Russia, just like what happened in Korea, in the Korean War. The country split up basically the same way. It's cut in half. And we were playing a defensive role in Vietnam. Kennedy said that, in his opinion, the war could only be won if Saigon's government changed its internal policies and built a better rapport with its citizens. Kennedy's his new tone and in this endeavor was supported by his advisors, which had returned from a fact-finding mission from South Vietnam, and they had actually said that the ROV, the Republic of Vietnam, and their army, the ARVN, were making great progress against the VC, the Viet Cong, and in that period of time, President Kennedy, he actually decided to withdraw at least 1,000 advisors from South Vietnam. Because of all the internal divisions that were going on in Vietnam at the time, Kennedy was accelerating the flow of American aid, and he had increased the advisors, the U.S. military advisors, according to GFKlibrary.org. He had increased the military advisors up to 16,000 people at that time. But he had also presented the president of South Vietnam, President Diem, and his government to make a change in the regiment, in the regime, to help get the people on their side. They need to make some very long overdue political and economic reforms. Basically, although Kennedy, according to Addington, although Kennedy had just embarked on a policy of gradual U.S. disengagement from South Vietnam, he reversed this course after he received word that there was a possibility of removing President Diem from the control he had in South Vietnam. At the time, there was a coup that was ongoing, and it involved President Diem's 3 generals that he had running the war at the time against the communists, and they wanted to remove him from power. And when President Diem didn't take Kennedy's advice and make some reforms to the government, President Kennedy went ahead and made a promise to these men, these generals under Diem, that if they did remove President Diem from power, that President Kennedy would promise further economic aid and military support. And according to Addington, this of course would make it very much more difficult for future administrations of the United States to find an honorable way out of the southeastern Asian Triangle. So basically they were under that obligation once they took Diem out of power. And Diem was assassinated November 1st. He was taken out, and unfortunately 20 days or so later, President Kennedy was also assassinated. And there's a controversial matter behind that, how that all took place and why it did. But basically, once Kennedy was assassinated, L.B. Johnson, his vice president, had to inherit this war. Nobody really knew whether Kennedy was going to commit more forces into Vietnam or pull more people out, because we'll never know because he was assassinated. But in return for that support that Kennedy requested from Diem to change his regime and institute new reform, to win over the people, and Diem had refused. He was threatened by Kennedy to have aid reduced, and that was one of the reasons why Kennedy had started to pull out some administrators. They saw the war was faring well for the ROV against the Viet Cong, but and according to History.com, there was the reforms from President Diem. They didn't go far enough, and the increased American aid provided insufficient power, basically, to stem this insurgency that had been going on in South Vietnam. So they removed Diem from presidency, and then Kennedy was assassinated. And again, at the time of Kennedy's death, there were still more than 16,000 U.S. advisors in South Vietnam. So when Kennedy's successor, President Johnson, came in, according to History.com, he rapidly escalated the war. So through further escalation, it resulted in the commitment of U.S. ground forces that eventually totaled more than 500,000 American troops in Vietnam. And this escalation of bringing in more troops, it really wasn't helping the war effort in several different ways, because both presidents were fighting a defensive war. And when you're fighting a defensive war, you're not really showing true commitment to your troops, to the people of your country. They're not really sure why they're there in the first place. They just believe they're fighting this war for another country, and they're not really making any ground. And in fact, there are a lot of borders that are keeping them from winning the Vietnam War, by just being there as a shield or guards of the nation, policing the country. They can't go into Laos. They can't go into Cambodia. They're afraid they're going to bring the war. They're going to bring China and Russia into the war, and they don't want the Reds, the communists, to come into the war and have a direct fight with them like they did in Korea. Even though at the time now we have China and Russia supplying the North Koreans with weapons and different forms of aid, just like we're supplying the South Vietnamese with different forms of aid. So when Lyndon Johnson comes into office and inherits this war, his administration's primary efforts are the Vietnam War. He wanted to change. He wanted to help change America for the better. He had a war on poverty lined up, and he had to take funds from that and put it all into the Vietnam War. Just increasingly more and more money was just poured into the Vietnam War, and lives and people, just resources, everything's just going into the Vietnam War. And it's really looking bad for Johnson and his future candidacy for president. So as in the MillerCenter.org presented their information, that the major initiative in Lyndon Johnson's presidency was the Vietnam War. In 1968, the United States had 548,000 troops in Vietnam and had already lost 30,000 Americans there at that time. So Johnson's approval ratings had dropped incredibly from 70% to below 40% by 1967. So with that, he quoted, "I can't get out. I can't finish it with what I have got. So the hell do I do?" End quote. He basically never did figure out the answer to that question. He started the Operation Rolling Thunder, basically as a tourniquet type strategy or tactic, and tick for tack tactics, where if the Viet Cong would come in and attack, we would go back and we would counterattack. We would take some territory away from them, but then we would withdraw and not really make any progress. Um, the war between South Vietnam was having some global ramifications, because we weren't the only ones there. The United States, they weren't the only ones there. There were other countries, part of the UN, that were there, but the United States, they were bearing most of the weight, and the communist regime there were willing to sacrifice people, and the United States public, they were not so much. They didn't like the idea of war and losing young men to a pointless war. And later on in Lyndon Johnson's presidency, during the Vietnam War, after the Tet Offensive, more specifically, he had General Wheeler come out and say that you need to give us more troops. General Wheeler's report to the president was that the Tet Offensive was basically a last-ditch effort of the communists, that this meant that we've got the upper hand now, so give us 200,000 more reinforcements, so we can properly defend our people in South Vietnam. If they had gotten the 200,000 men, he said, we could possibly use them to launch a counterattack and cause some damage and actually end this war. But Lyndon Johnson was very wary of sending in that many more troops. He knew public opinion was already really bad for him, and he was basically planning on dropping out of any further race for presidency. So he denied that large amount of troops to be sent over to Vietnam. Instead, he acquiesced to Wheeler's request of just a modest, more 20-something thousand reinforcements, according to Addington. This information was leaked out somehow to the public, possibly through the Pentagon, but it was picked up in the story was picked up by Times Magazine, that Westmoreland needed an additional 206,000 American troops, and America had said, why would you need this many more troops? Because if the Tet Offensive was so successful, you wouldn't need that many more troops. It caused a lot of public outcry, and it just looked really bad for Johnson. And his strategic objective in South Vietnam was a defensive strategy of containment, and that was how it all started, basically to contain communism. And so at this point, he didn't want to further escalate the war and send in a massive amount of troops, 250,000 more people. And he started at this point, once the outcry came out and people saw that the generals want more bodies put into Vietnam, that he was going to start a method of pulling them out. So he declared later on that he was going to begin pulling people out of Vietnam. Of course, he made a couple of decisions, according to history.net or historynet.com, that made the strategy for the victory in Vietnam very controversial. The two decisions made by President Johnson in 1967 offered compelling evidence for interpreting his controversial escalation of the American involvement or the American role in the Vietnam War as a temporary one rather than as a new strategy for victory. First, he sent Ellsworth Bunker to South Vietnam as the new ambassador with private instructions to prepare for the disengagement of American forces. Second, that summer, he denied Westmoreland's request for the substantial augmentation of American combat forces for the tactical use against communist bases inside South Vietnam. They wanted to strictly play defense and keep this a war, not an American war. But, I mean, as we can see with over 500,000 troops, this clearly is an American war, and in my opinion, they should have just went in and went all out and acted as if they were really in a war. I mean, unfortunately, some of those decisions, by not fully committing to the war, by playing these defensive strategies, it really lowered the morale of the troops that were there and also the American public. One of the quotes that L.B. Johnson is seen using quite often was winning hearts and minds of the people in Vietnam. And in that quote, it comes from the Bible. It comes from St. Paul's letter to the Philippians. And it was in chapter 4, verse 7. And the peace of God, which passes all understanding, will keep your hearts and minds in Jesus Christ, in Christ Jesus. When St. Paul wrote that letter, he was in prison. He was forced into a state of where he had to contend with starvation, with oppression, and just like we were forced into this war, into Vietnam, and the people who were in Vietnam that we were there to help were being oppressed. We were there. We sent our troops there to remind them that we were there to help them, and the objective was to win their hearts and minds, and to allow them to fight that war for themselves and defeat the communist threat that they were under. And at the end of the letter, near the end of the letter to the Philippians, in chapter 10, verse 13, Paul says, "I can do all things in him who strengthens me." He's talking about in Jesus Christ who strengthens him. And when he says that I can do all things, he doesn't mean that he can go and fly or climb a mountain, but he can withstand the torment that he was going through by keeping Jesus Christ in his mind, in his heart, and in his mind. And I believe that in the mission to set out and win the hearts and minds of the Vietnam people, President Kennedy and President Johnson both had good intentions, but their political strategies for the war, in terms of military strategies and political strategies, they ended up with disastrous outcomes in many ways, unfortunately. And in the end, we lost the war. But even today, we have the Vietnamese people reaching out today for our help again, and we'll have to see where that goes and plays in another story. But I thank you so much for being here today and hearing this video presentation. And I wish you a Merry Christmas and Happy New Year, Happy Holidays, and God bless you.